Okay, well, welcome back to NENA Ignite, everyone. The title of this session is Telecommunicator Reclassification, more than just a job title. So you can guess from that title that we are going to go a little bit more deeply into TC reclassification than most sessions have in the past. And I think this will be a really interesting discussion. So here's a little agenda to get us kicked off here and give you a bit of a roadmap for what we'll be talking about, so you can schedule your naps and your coffee breaks and whatnot. So the first thing that we'll talk about is the actual BLS SOC, the Bureau of Labor Statistics Standard Occupational Classification System. We're going to start with the 2018 SOC revision, and we're going to dive pretty deeply into the BLS feedback to the 911 community as to how they came to their conclusion that telecommunicators should not be reclassified as a protective service. Then we're going to talk about the next SOC revision, and we're going to go into what we need to do to ensure we see telecommunicator reclassification at the federal level. So in order to do that, we've got to know how the Bureau of Labor Statistics revises the SOC. We've got to know how exactly the telecommunicator's role is changing. And then we got to talk about the groundwork that we have to do on this. We got to talk about job titles, and we got to talk about descriptions and about how old your job titles and descriptions are. Then we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the public expectations of 911 and how these things don't necessarily align with each other yet, and how that is sort of the source of the problem, or one of the primary sources of the misunderstanding, essentially, between BLS and the 911 community. And then after that, I will take over and give a discussion about state and local efforts to reclassify telecommunicators and also federal efforts. But I'm mostly going to focus on the sort of exciting emerging world of state-level telecommunicator reclassification, and then talk about how you can do this in your own state. So I'm going to hand things over to my guest, Kate Elkins, now. Kate works with the National 911 Office and is an exceptional resource on telecommunicator reclassification. And she's going to take things from here.
Thank you, Dan. My name is Kate Elkins, and I am an EMS and 911 specialist at the NHTSA Office of EMS, or Emergency Medical Services, and the National 911 Program. Our office, the National 911 Program, convenes stakeholders. We bring people together to work on the challenging problems that are facing 911. We create and share resources so that everybody across the country can have those basic tools to help advance the profession. And then we also administer grant funding to improve 911 services, including our current Next Gen 911 grant program. We are limited in our abilities to really those three things that we were created as a national office to do. However, we have a lot of fun with events like this, bringing you all together to collaborate and really work towards advancing this profession.
Your professional background is particularly well suited to talking about reclassification issues for a lot of different reasons. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, Dan. So I'm still an active paramedic responding to 911 calls. I have been a volunteer EMT or paramedic for the last 23 years, so I'm on the other end of the radio. And telecommunicators are my safety net. You keep my people safe, you keep my trainees safe. I teach paramedics. I'm a field preceptor for paramedics. I'm on Maryland Task Force 1, so I even do some disaster response work as a paramedic. And then on the other side of the coin, I have a master's in public health, and I studied injury prevention. So I've had a focus on what can be done to improve the wellness and prevent injury and harm to the EMS and 911 workforce. So a little bit about the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Standard Occupational Classification. It's a statistical standard. It's used by the federal government. Multiple different agencies use it. It's to classify workers into occupational categories for the purpose of collecting, calculating, and disseminating data. This is used a lot in research, especially when you're researching impacts on workforce. And right now, it's really a good time to be thinking about making sure that we are doing what we can to make research easy to do for our workforce because we all know what the impacts of everything going on. We need that research. The SOC is one of several standard classifications. It's established by the Office of Management and Budget, so they ultimately control. BLS SOC will make recommendations to OMB, and then they ultimately make the decisions. There are 23 major groups, 94 minor groups, lots of different occupations. When you look at the detailed occupations, you're looking at 867 detailed occupations. So that's a lot to manage. And it's used in different ways, but primarily it's for statistical research, okay?
So there was a revision to the BLS SOC back around 2018. Is this something that happens regularly? And can you talk to us a little bit more about that 2018 revision?
Yeah, so in the past, they were doing revisions approximately every 10 years. They have some flexibility about when they do the revisions, but I believe that they are still on track to do a revision again in 2028. And what that really means is they start gathering data ahead of time to look at if there are jobs that need to be reclassified. So in 2018, there were a lot of requests to reclassify. And the challenge is that with all the information that they had, they responded back to the 911 community. Despite a large volume of requests, the data that they had really limited what they were able to change. And so the job title Public Safety Telecommunicator was added as an example, but it was not made the primary title because in their research, it really showed that dispatcher was the most commonly used title, 93% of the time. And so the challenge with changing the system, it's a statistical system. They're really just looking at grouping like with like. If the work is similar, if the type of work is similar, then they get grouped together. They are not looking at value judgments. They're not looking at impact. They're just looking at the type of work and putting like with like. If you look at EMS, emergency medical technicians and paramedics are grouped within healthcare. They are not actually grouped in the same section as firefighters and police officers. So they're putting like work with other like work.
Very early on there, you said something about the data that BLS collected on this. Could you talk a little bit more about the sort of data collection process? It sounds like this is a little bit different than, them sort of reading letters that come in from PSAPs, for instance, that there was a process here.
Exactly, Dan. So if you are trying to change a law in your community, or if you're trying to get the national system to change something politically, you're going to send as many notes to your representatives as possible, right? That's really how, as a community, you impact that type of a system. This doesn't work that way. It's not the volume of communications that they receive that helps them to change the classification. It's a statistical classification. It's changed based on data. So when the committee went and they pulled 1,000 job descriptions at small, medium, and large centers throughout the country, the work that was described was largely clerical, taking calls, entering them into a system, and really a lot of the more technical aspects of the job, we all know in this room or whatever room you're sitting in virtually, that there's so much more to the telecommunicator's job than simply taking calls, entering them in a system. But if that's not reflected in the job descriptions, in the work that's described by employers, in the work that's described based on the training requirements, et cetera, then it's hard for BLS SOC to see that data. So having lists of training requirements, having the technical aspects of the job described, that really helps the BLS SOC see that this is a different job than somebody who simply answers the phone and enters information into a system. Additionally, they did look at OSHA data for what sort of workplace injuries were reported for people in this position. And almost all of those injuries were related to clerical work. And then they also will seek data from reliable federal sources, reaching out to any related agency that they can. Now, the National 911 program will, if we have good data that we can present to them, we'll be able to present some of that to them as a reliable agency. However, simply having that data in your job description and having requirements for training, requirements for different technology you have to be able to use, different aspects of the job well described in your community is very important, because they also go out and collect 1,000 job descriptions. They also go out and collect data. They don't simply wait for us to tell them. So non-statistical uses of this classification are irrelevant to the BLS SOC, because they're not building this system for all the other purposes that it ultimately is used by local government and other aspects of government or other agencies. They're building it purely to be able to differentiate jobs for statistical analysis purposes. And from my perspective, this is important because a lot of the research into mental health consequences will be utilizing this statistical system to differentiate jobs.
So Kate, you said that there's potentially another round, so to speak, of BLS revisions coming up.
Based on the information we've obtained from the BLS SOC, there is a tentative goal of doing a revision for 2028. What that means is they should start collecting data around 2024. That gives us 4 years to improve the data landscape and really make sure that when they start pulling information about our profession, that they are pulling information that adequately reflects the job that you all do. It really reflects the complexity, the technology, the training, and the level of expertise and professionalism that you have, so that we can advance this forward, whether we get the revision to change or not.
So our shot clock here is pretty long, but it sounds like we have quite a bit to do. I want to move toward that, more to do part and put a finer point on that. So do you want to talk a little bit about how the BLS goes about revising the SOC?
Yes, Dan. So every time that they revise the SOC, they can tweak it a little bit. So we don't know for sure how they're going to do this next revision. We do have some information that we believe is really consistent with past revisions. We don't think that there will be a huge change, but we want to really focus our efforts on a couple of key aspects that traditionally they have always incorporated. The nature of the work performed, how the work is performed, and how it is distinct, and how it really means that this is a different job than the current classification. Being able to say that this can't be grouped in with this classification. It needs to be separated into a different one because the job is really distinct. It's really different. And how you can differentiate yourself is improve your job titles, improve the job descriptions, really describe the required education and training, and describe all the tools and technologies that you're utilizing. It's not simply answering the phone. Those days of simply answering the phone and typing or writing into a system are definitely gone. How old are your job descriptions? When our office went to look into job descriptions across the country after the revision did not include a change, we found some really interesting data. Did you know some of the job descriptions that we found were older than the employees who are filling the position? When was the last time your department or your center changed your job descriptions, updated your job descriptions? Was it 5 years ago, 10 years ago? The fact that we have some job descriptions in this country that are over 20 to 25 years old is a problem, because how much has changed in the last 25 years in terms of technology? It's not just the technology that's changed. How you call 911 has changed. 25 years ago, it was a landline call, one call, maybe a couple calls if multiple people drove on to the next exit to go to a payphone to call 911 about the collision. Now you have landline calls, you have cell calls, you have more and more jurisdictions that are doing text to 911. There's just a lot more technology involved, a lot more ways that you can contact 911. And tomorrow, as we move into next gen, how many different ways are we going to be contacting those 911 centers? There's going to be so much more technology, so many more inputs, so much more data. And it's not just going to be voice. It's not just going to be text. We're going to be adding in video. We're going to be adding in all of these different aspects. And the irony is the general public thinks we're already there. If you watch any of the TV shows that are now popping up, and it's great to show that there are TV shows that are now showing 911 telecommunicators hard at work. As a practicing paramedic, I will tell you that I have hated most of these shows for a long time because the general public watches them and they say, oh, great, these paramedics, I call 911, they come, they do CPR, they save my loved one, they sit up, we all hug, it's great. And as everybody knows, that's not really how life happens. NHTSA recently did some research and we got 5,000 responses from across the country. It's a representative sample. And what we found is when you look across the country, 92% of the respondents expected to receive pre-arrival instructions from 911 operators while waiting for an ambulance. Do 92% of our centers across the country have the ability to give pre-arrival instructions? I don't think we're there yet, but the general public believes we are. 77%, more than half of the respondents didn't know if the 911 center could identify their caller's location without them telling them. So that's a good thing. But how many people now think that the 911 center has the same data as Uber or as any of these different delivery services that we're now utilizing during COVID-19? So a lot of people have this assumption that because I can do all these things on my cell phone, because it works on my cell phone, that when I contact 911, they're going to have that same technology. The public expectations are not reality-based. They're based on a lot of TV inputs and other inputs and just assumptions. I can't tell you how many times in meetings I have to educate other federal partners or the general public about 911 and what we can do right now, what we are doing right now, and what we need to advance, what we need to improve our technology to be able to do. And so the fact that 72% of the respondents indicated they would be willing to pay more for expanded 911 gives me hope that we will do better to better fund in the future and better expand the technology of our 911 centers. Because everybody assumes you already have all those tools at your disposal. We need to make sure that we get those tools ready to go so that we can do the best that this profession can do. You're doing a lot with very limited technology, and it's amazing the work that you're doing now. But imagine if we got you up to that technology so that we could do all of these things the public already expects us to do. And as a paramedic, I understand the unreasonable public expectations. They're always going to be there. The television shows sometimes help, sometimes don't with those expectations. But I'm really glad to see the 911 dispatchers represented more and more on those television shows so that all of us from EMS, police, and fire are not the only ones who have to deal with the challenges of those shows.
Let's say that I am a PSAP director, and I'm really, really interested in taking your advice on this presentation, redoing all my job descriptions to more clearly emphasize the involvement of advanced techniques, advanced technology, and advanced operations in 911. Where do I start?
So our office, in an effort to give you better resources in order to try and have consistency in language and really target those areas of the job description that will help, we have some resources on 911.gov. There's a whole section for the job reclassification, and there's a toolkit that will help you with language, and it's really sort of a take what you need language so that you can pick and choose which aspects really apply to your center, and it's built for all different size centers. We had a great team of experts help us to build this tool to help you change your job classification. And it also has information for how do you talk to your HR office if they're not part of your agency, or how do you talk to other aspects of wherever your PSAP is housed to convince them why it's important to change your job classification. Why is it important to really describe the work that you're doing? Every time that people have to change an aspect of administrative or bureaucratic process, it can be a challenge, but there's benefit for them as well as there's benefit for your center. Because if you think about it, if we adequately describe all of the things that you're doing and all the technology that you're using, that might actually help them as they're going into budget season, et cetera.
So speaking of budget, with the COVID-induced recession, the current economic state of affairs, things are maybe going to be looking challenging for PSAPs in the next few months, perhaps years. Will updating my job descriptions to make them more robust and more advanced, will that shrink my applicant pool, and will that make my staffing shortage worse?
So with COVID-19, there are really significant workforce challenges in EMS and 911 workforces. Our office has been doing a lot of work on both. Having a really good job description and being concerned about, am I weeding people out too early? I think I would flip that around and say, are you investing a lot of time, energy, and training on people who shouldn't be there because they're not going to stay, they're not going to make it all the way through? When I'm training a new paramedic, I want them to know what they're getting into. I want them to be sure that that's what they want to do. I think it's the same for a telecommunicator. They need to know what they're getting into. But you're also going to find there are a whole bunch of people that wanted to be part of this response, wanted to help our country facing COVID-19, facing all of these challenges. And you might actually find that there are people who, when they find out I can do all of this work, I can help all of these first responders, I can use this technology, I'm able to integrate my passion for technology with a passion for helping people, I'm able to keep other first responders safe. There are a lot of things that a telecommunicator does that is really rewarding. You see really challenging things, but you do incredible work. And so you just have to find those people who are willing to face the challenges because of the benefits of the incredible work that they get to do. And I think that if you are looking at it as, I'm going to scare people away by fully describing this amazing job and this amazing work that we're doing, you're kind of missing the boat, because you're also not recruiting those people who have a passion and want to help and want to serve, who very much could be the innovators for your field that help to move you forward.
All right, great. Thank you, Kate. At this point in our session, I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about legislative efforts toward telecommunicator reclassification. I want you to stop for a moment and take in everything that Kate had to say, because I know there was a lot of information in there and it's all really useful. And in a lot of ways, what I'm going to tell you is going to be very different from what Kate talked about. It's going to be basically a separate track of your mind, even though it's essentially it's at its core the same subject, and it aims to right the same wrong that we're talking about, which is, of course, why we share a session here. The reason the subtitle for my section is an update on efforts on and off Capitol Hill is because we're seeing a lot of really exciting and encouraging progress inside the states and inside localities and municipalities and regions of states in terms of telecommunicator reclassification. And that is as, if not more important for our purposes than federal reclassification efforts. So the first thing I want to talk about here is a principle that sort of makes a connection between legislative reclassification, what I'm going to talk about, and what Kate just covered, which is sort of regulatory reclassification. And that is that 911 has a chicken and egg problem. So we know what happens inside the PSAP. We know what happens inside the 911 and the NG 911 network. We know about the 911 technology, operations, and responsibilities. There is an entire universe outside of 911 and outside of public safety communications, sometimes inside, unfortunately, of folks who don't know and recognize that what is going on inside 911 technology, operations, and responsibilities is hugely complex and hugely demanding, and not at all what we were doing 50 years ago when the first 911 systems were installed and when the number was first stood up. So for this reason, we need to not only be making the changes at the PSAP and the local level inside our own structures, like rewriting our job descriptions, as Kate mentioned, but we also need to be talking about forcing the outside world to recognize what we do, what we know that we do. If we dive into this a little bit more deeply, we can kind of break it down on a little more theoretical level, if you'll bear with me on that. So when Kate talks about regulatory reclassification through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS is a part of the federal government, which specifically it's a part of the executive branch. And when we usually refer to the federal government as, an entity as a whole, right? If we're not talking about Congress, then we're usually talking about an executive branch agency. And the way that executive branch agencies are held accountable, so to speak, the way that they're kept in line is through rules of procedure specifically, as well as these rules that are set by Congress. A good example of this is the FCC, which has established a notice and comment process for determining the outcomes of telecommunications issues in the United States. Now, it didn't set up the notice and comment procedure for fun, right? Or because it's more convenient for FCC staff. It set it up because it is required by something called the Administrative Procedure Act to make its decisions in a balanced and transparent and fair way where there is opportunity for comment and for consideration of the comments of any stakeholders who might be affected by any of these decisions. So those rules of procedure bound every executive agency in one way or another. And of course, the APA is a law passed by Congress. Now, if we go back to, middle school, to, how a bill becomes a law, Congress passes a law, and that law is then carried out by agencies of the executive branch, if that is a federal law that sort of affects federal processes, right? So Ray-Baum's Act is a perfect example of this. Congress passed Ray-Baum's Act. Ray-Baum's Act directed the FCC to carry out a notice and comment process to establish dispatchable location rules for VoIP and for multi-line telephone systems. So Congress doesn't have the ability to enforce laws. Can only pass them, and then it has to rely on the executive branch to enforce those. But it can hold the executive branch accountable for not enforcing those laws or enforcing those laws in a way that is not in line with what we call congressional intent. Okay, so back to regulatory reclassification here. The BLS has designated, so to speak, BLS's identification of public safety telecommunicators as public safety telecommunicators as a clerical occupation is based on a collection of data that BLS did, and it is for statistical purposes, and its sort of greater purpose is to create this centralized knowledge structure from which the rest of the federal government can operate, so that a public safety telecommunicator means the same thing to the Federal Communications Commission that it does to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, legislative reclassification is an entirely different animal. When we talked about regulatory reclassification in the executive branch, the accountability mechanism is process, right? It's procedure, and it is accountability to Congress. Congress, on the other hand, is not accountable necessarily to anyone in Washington. It's accountable to the voters. In that way, the acts that are written and passed through Congress, congressmen and congresswomen are accountable to their fellow congresspeople in the sense that you don't want to write a crazy bill or do anything wild that breaches the trust of your colleagues in Congress, and you certainly don't want to do that if it breaches the trust of the voters who elected you. So legislators are bound by voters, which gives them sort of a totally separate and very, very different incentive structure. Now, in terms of passing laws and setting the rules, so to speak, Congress can pass literally any law. Congress could pass a law tomorrow that says that the sky is green. Now, of course, they are bound by voters at the end of the day. So if voters decide that the sky is blue and they don't really like that their congressman sponsored and voted for this legislation to say that the sky is green, then ideally you have another candidate come up for election in that congressman's district, and in 2 years or in 4 years or in 6 years, the voters choose to replace that incumbent congressman with a new congressperson who hopefully believes that the sky is blue. So I said earlier that the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes out and they collect data, right? They do an affirmative act to go and get data. Legislative staff, on the other hand, the folks who actually write the laws, right? Most congressmen don't sit down and draft the bills that they want to happen, right? Because they're too busy doing any number of other things, right? They're showing up for votes. They're showing up for committee hearings. They are going to, constituent meetings, right? Back in the home district, etc., right? That's why they hire staff. These staff are provided data by people like me and by people like you, and that's the data that they have to work with. They can also hit up the National 911 office for data, which goes to what Kate was talking about when she said it's really helpful for 911 centers, for PSAPs, to pass data up to the National 911 program, because when Congress comes to the expert agencies, they come looking for data, and the National 911 office, they can provide it. They can't provide it without being asked, to be fair, because there are safeguards against interference by the executive branch in the daily business of the legislative branch. The takeaway here is that the staff are provided data, right? The staff are not professional data gatherers. Rather, they are professional listeners. So the result of that is a decentralized knowledge structure. So you may have a staffer in Office A who knows a lot of things about highway asphalt composition. You may have a staffer in Office B who doesn't, who's new to the job, right? Who's not an expert on these things and doesn't really have a background as in civil engineering or transportation engineering or anything like that. Staffer A doesn't have to share that information with Staffer B, but they can, right? And it benefits both of them generally. Now, from a lobbyist perspective or from a director of government affairs perspective, like me, I want to make sure that I talk to both of these people, but my conversation with Staffer A and my conversation with Staffer B are going to be very different. Now, that's more art of advocacy stuff. The takeaway from this for you is that you need to be talking to Staffer A, Staffer B, Staffer C, Staffer D, because the more you can spread this knowledge, the more powerful that knowledge becomes. So hopefully I haven't put you to sleep with all of that heady theoretical talk about the functions of the U.S. federal government. I want to move on next to the current federal legislation, which, if you haven't been living under a rock for the last 12 or so months, you are aware of an act called 911 Saves. And that act is authored by Representative Norma Torres and Representative Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, as well as Senators Burr and Klobuchar, will simply direct the Office of Management and Budget to reclassify telecommunicators as a protective service under the BLS SOC. And Kate already laid out all the facts behind that and all the sort of specific implications of that. But what you need to know is the following. The bill was introduced in March of 2019, and it quickly amassed a large number of co-sponsors. It moved into some unique committees. The House Education and Labor Committee specifically is the one that we're most concerned about for our discussion purposes. And after a little bit of debate, it got moved into the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. So that was actually in 2019 in the summer. So they passed the NDAA the summer prior to the year where it takes effect. So right now, in 2020, Congress is currently debating the NDAA for 2021. The bill passed the House as part of the NDAA in the summer of 2019 and moved to what's known as a conference committee. Now, a conference committee is where competing versions of Senate and House bills are reconciled. So if the Senate passes an NDAA and the House passes an NDAA and they differ in their language, then the conference committee is where those differences get ironed out. Unfortunately, the Senate version did not contain 911 saves, and during conference committee, 911 saves was removed from the NDAA, which was really, it was a big setback. The bill now sort of still stands. It's still in play, so to speak. It has 128 House co-sponsors and 27 Senate co-sponsors as of the filming of this session. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who pushed back on this bill. However, it has been met with resistance in the House Education and Labor Committee. The nature of this resistance is that the House Ed and Labor Committee spoke with BLS, and BLS basically made their case to House Ed and Labor, and as an expert agency, House Ed and Labor trusted BLS on the issue and gave a basically identical list of arguments against reclassification that BLS had given and that Kate read off in her section of this session. So for the time being, the bill is essentially considered stalled out. It would be pretty difficult to change the opinion of the House Ed and Labor Committee absent some substantial change in the amount and quality of the data that we can provide to the Hill, which is part of the reason why Kate's section is so incredibly important, and why it's incredibly important that you all are updating job descriptions and sharing those job descriptions with other PSAPs and with your state 911 administrators and with the National 911 Office, right? Spreading those far and wide and getting the word out that 911 is much more professional than most people outside of 911 consider it to be. So the upside to the battle for 911 saves is that it has garnered just huge support and huge activation of 911 proponents. And it's really changed the discussion around 911 and around reclassification, right? It's now no longer a theoretical. It is a thing that we can actually do and that needs to be done. And we're convincing people right and left on this. It just so happens that these federal experts in the BLS may be some of the hardest to convince. But that said, we're seeing a lot of success at the state level, which is really encouraging. So you see this map here that I have. The purple states here are states that have passed laws in the last 2 years to reclassify telecommunicators or to grant them some sort of extra professional rights in some way, shape, or form. So for instance, we have Colorado, which hasn't necessarily reclassified telecommunicators, but what it has done is it has broadened a law for occupational health and safety that now allows telecommunicators, and anyone else for that matter, to be eligible for workers' compensation for trauma that they experienced audibly and not just in person or visibly experienced. So this is a huge step forward for telecommunicators in the state of Colorado, and it can also serve as a great template for other states to be doing this sort of reclassification. Now, if you're looking for more of the sort of traditional reclassification legislation, you can look no further than California Assembly Bill 1945, which, as of today, sits on the governor's desk, having been passed by both the House and the Senate in California. We anxiously await signature by the governor. That should become a law any day now, which is very exciting. AB 1945 merely recognizes dispatchers as first responders. That's it. Simple, straightforward. In Texas, as part of House Bill 1090, public safety telecommunicators are now eligible for traumatic brain injury training. They are now aligned with the rest of public safety in being eligible to bring claims of discrimination after they've been discharged for filing a workers' compensation claim. They can now receive, in a response situation, otherwise non-public info about communicable diseases or health conditions. Obviously very timely and very important in COVID. And they're now protected against civil damages for liability care that is not willfully or wantonly negligent during the course of their actions. So all of these things serve to align telecommunicators closer with the rest of our public safety colleagues, which is both a practical improvement in the professional lives of these telecommunicators, but also it is essentially reclassification, if not in name, at least in function. Indiana House Bill 1198 does something very similar. It redefines first responders in Indiana law to include public safety telecommunicators. Now, Georgia is a little bit different. Georgia is actually a resolution recognizing 911 and public safety telecommunicators as first responders. So that's another way to sort of skin the cat. So Maryland, for their part, shout out to my neighbors to the east, in SB 284, renames 911 public safety telecommunicators 911 specialists and declares that 911 specialists are key members of the team of public safety personnel. And finally, in Iowa, you have Senate File 2373, which passed a little bit earlier this spring, which renames dispatchers as public safety telecommunicators and reclassifies them as first responders. So if you're looking to stand up efforts in your own state or locality or region to do reclassification, then I highly recommend that you look at some of these state bills and get a feel for the different ways that the law can be changed to reclassify telecommunicators in your state. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of different ways to do this, some of which don't even require really renaming telecommunicators or explicitly reclassifying telecommunicators. Really, even these smallest adjustments, like things like workers' compensation, right, can be adjusted to demonstrate that 911 is just as much a part of the first responder ecosystem as police, fire, EMS. So going forward, I think that you as the viewer and me as the government affairs professional for NENA and Kate as a staff member inside the National 911 office have a series of different but related action items. While we're fairly certain that 911 Saves is not going to cross the finish line in this Congress and certainly not before the election, we know that there is widespread support in Congress among congressmen and senators for this effort, and that we can and will build a case for reclassification either inside of or outside of the standard BLS process for reclassification. I think at the state levels, there are a lot of opportunities for success in terms of reclassification and in terms of securing concrete benefits for telecommunicators and improving and further professionalizing the profession of 911 call taking and dispatching. Kate and I are going to be around for an additional 10 minutes after this session to answer any questions in the chat, and we are happy to do that. Best of luck with all of your home state's reclassification efforts, and as always, feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks for watching our session, and enjoy the rest of NENA Ignite.